the human remains found in a back alley, and the clues that solved it. When a sanitation worker made a grim discovery behind a row of restaurants in downtown Portland, no one could have predicted that this case would expose a network of corruption stretching across 3 states. The remains found that cold November morning belonged to someone who had been missing for 8 years, and the clues left behind would unravel one of the most complex criminal conspiracies in the Pacific Northwest's history. It was 6:30 on a Thursday morning when Marcus Chen began his usual route through the commercial district of downtown Portland. Marcus had been working for the city's sanitation department for 12 years, and he knew every alley, every dumpster, every corner of his route like the back of his hand. He had seen plenty of unpleasant things in his career: discarded furniture, restaurant waste, the occasional raccoon, but nothing had prepared him for what he would find on this particular morning. The alley behind Merchant Street was narrow, barely wide enough for his truck to navigate. Brick buildings rose 3 and 4 stories on either side, their fire escapes creating geometric shadows in the early morning light. 7 restaurants backed onto this alley, and Marcus knew each one by the particular smell of their dumpsters. Italian, Chinese, steakhouse, Thai, burger joint, seafood, and Mexican. It was like a tour of international cuisine conducted entirely through the sense of smell. As Marcus approached the dumpster behind Chen's Golden Dragon, the Chinese restaurant that had no relation to him despite the shared surname, he noticed something unusual. There was a blue tarp partially visible behind the dumpster, wedged between the container and the brick wall. Tarps weren't uncommon in alleys, used to cover equipment or protect materials from rain. But something about this one caught his attention. It was too carefully positioned, too deliberately placed. Marcus parked his truck and walked over to investigate. The morning air was cold enough that his breath formed clouds, and the alley was still in shadow, the sun not yet high enough to reach this narrow corridor between buildings. He pulled on his work gloves and reached for the edge of the tarp. What he saw made him stumble backward, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Beneath the tarp, partially concealed by black plastic garbage bags, were unmistakable human remains. Even with his limited knowledge, Marcus could tell these remains had been here for a considerable time. He immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking as he gave his location to the dispatcher. Within 20 minutes, the alley had been transformed into a crime scene. Police officers cordoned off both ends of the narrow passage. Detective Linda Morrison arrived with her partner, Detective James Rodriguez. Linda had been with the Portland Police Department's homicide unit for 15 years, and she had investigated more than 80 murder cases. As she approached the scene, taking in the positioning of the remains and the method of concealment, her experienced eye told her this was going to be complicated. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Young, arrived shortly after and began her preliminary examination. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, which would make immediate identification difficult. However, Dr. Young noted several important details. The remains appeared to be those of an adult male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. More significantly, there were clear signs of trauma to the skull, indicating this was likely a homicide rather than a case of someone dying of natural causes and being disposed of afterward. But it was what else they found with the remains that would prove crucial to solving the case. Wrapped in plastic alongside the body were several items that had been preserved from the elements. A wallet, though damaged by moisture, still contained an ID card that was partially legible. A cell phone, old model, non-functional but potentially recoverable for data. A watch with an inscription on the back. And most intriguingly, a small notebook, its pages water-damaged but not entirely destroyed, with handwriting still visible on many pages. Detective Morrison carefully bagged each item as evidence, her mind already working through the implications. Someone had dumped these remains here, but they had either failed to remove these identifying items or had wanted the body to eventually be found and identified. The location itself was interesting. This alley saw regular traffic from sanitation workers, delivery drivers, restaurant employees. It wasn't a remote location where remains might go undiscovered for years. Yet somehow, these remains had been here long enough to decompose significantly without being noticed. Back at the police station, the investigative team began the painstaking work of identification. The ID card in the wallet, once cleaned and examined under proper lighting, revealed a name: Thomas Brennan. The photo, though faded, showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair and sharp features. Detective Rodriguez ran the name through the missing persons database while Morrison examined the other recovered items. The watch inscription read, "To Tommy, love always, M." The date engraved was June 15, 2008. The cell phone was an older model smartphone, the kind that had been popular in the mid-2010s. If they could recover any data from it, it might provide crucial information about Thomas Brennan's final days. Rodriguez looked up from his computer screen, his expression grim. "We've got a match. Thomas Brennan, reported missing in March 2016. Last seen leaving his apartment in the Pearl District. Age 37 at the time of disappearance. Worked as a financial analyst for Morrison and Associates." He paused. "That's interesting. Morrison and Associates was investigated 3 years ago for fraud, but the case fell apart due to lack of evidence." Morrison leaned over to look at the screen, studying the missing person report. Thomas Brennan's girlfriend, Maria Santos, had filed the report after he failed to show up for work for 3 consecutive days and wasn't answering his phone. According to the report, Thomas had seemed anxious in the weeks before his disappearance, telling Maria that he had discovered something at work that troubled him, but refusing to give her details. He had promised to tell her everything once he had gathered more information. The investigation at the time had gone nowhere. Thomas's apartment showed no signs of struggle. His car was in its parking spot. His credit cards and bank accounts showed no activity after his disappearance. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The case had eventually gone cold, another unsolved missing person case in a file cabinet. But now they had remains, and they had evidence. Dr. Yang's full autopsy report came back within 48 hours. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Based on the state of decomposition and the presence of certain insect activity, Dr. Yang estimated that Thomas had been killed approximately 8 years ago, which aligned with the time of his disappearance. The body had been wrapped in plastic and the tarp almost immediately after death, which had affected the decomposition process. While the forensics team worked on the remains, Detective Morrison focused on the notebook. The pages were fragile, and a document specialist was brought in to carefully separate and preserve them. As the pages were photographed and enhanced, a story began to emerge. Thomas Brennan had been documenting financial irregularities at Morrison and Associates. The notebook contained dates, transaction amounts, account numbers, and names. Lots of names. Thomas had discovered that the firm was running an elaborate money laundering scheme. Client funds were being mixed with money from illegal sources, cleaned through a series of complex transactions, and then distributed back to criminal organizations minus a substantial fee. The scheme had been operating for at least 5 years before Thomas stumbled upon it, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. But Thomas had done more than just document the scheme. According to his notes, he had confronted his supervisor, Richard Morrison, the son of the firm's founder. Richard had assured Thomas that there was a reasonable explanation, that he was misunderstanding the transactions. He had asked Thomas to give him a few days to explain everything properly. Thomas, perhaps naively, had agreed to wait. That meeting had taken place on March 18, 2016. Thomas Brennan was last seen alive on March 21, 2016. According to his final notebook entries, Richard Morrison had called him that evening, asking to meet in person to discuss the situation. Thomas had agreed, noting in his journal that he planned to record the conversation on his phone. Detective Morrison and Rodriguez began building their case. The notebook provided a roadmap of the criminal operation, but they needed more. They needed to prove that Richard Morrison had killed Thomas Brennan, or at the very least, had ordered his death. They needed to connect the physical evidence to specific suspects. The forensics team managed to recover data from Thomas's old cell phone. Among the files were several audio recordings from March 2016. One of them, dated March 21st, was particularly damning. In the recording, Thomas could be heard meeting with Richard Morrison. The conversation started cordially enough, with Richard explaining that the transactions Thomas had noticed were completely legitimate, part of a complex but legal tax strategy. But as Thomas pressed for details, citing specific transactions and accounts, Richard's tone changed. "You need to let this go, Tommy," Richard's voice on the recording said, tension evident. "You're in over your head. These are powerful people. If you push this, if you go to the authorities, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything. Is that a threat?" Thomas's voice responded, remarkably calm. "It's friendly advice. But yes, if you want to call it a threat, it's a threat. Walk away from this. Forget what you think you saw. Or there will be consequences." The recording ended shortly after, with Thomas saying he needed time to think. But Detective Morrison knew that Thomas never got that time. Somewhere between that meeting and the next morning, Thomas Brennan had been murdered. With the audio recording and the notebook as evidence, detectives began investigating Richard Morrison and the firm. They discovered that Morrison and Associates had closed down in 2018, 2 years after Thomas's disappearance, officially due to the retirement of the senior partners. In reality, as investigators now uncovered, the closure had been precipitated by increased scrutiny from financial regulators. The firm had shut down and distributed its remaining legitimate assets before investigators could build a case. Richard Morrison had gone on to start a new consulting firm, operating under a different name but essentially providing the same services. He lived in an expensive home in the West Hills, drove a luxury car, and was active in local business circles. He had never been charged with any crime, and Thomas Brennan's disappearance had never been officially connected to him. Detective Morrison obtained a warrant and brought Richard Morrison in for questioning. At 52 years old, Richard was a polished businessman who had clearly been through media training. He had a lawyer present immediately and initially refused to answer any questions about Thomas Brennan. But Morrison had one advantage: the audio recording. When she played it during the interview, watching Richard's face as he heard his own voice threatening Thomas Brennan, she saw his composure crack for just a moment. His lawyer immediately called for a break, and Morrison knew they were getting close. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michael Patterson, who had been Richard Morrison's driver in 2016, walked into the police station 3 days after Richard's initial interview. Patterson was in his 60s now, retired, and according to him, his conscience had been bothering him for 8 years. Patterson told investigators that on the night of March 21, 2016, Richard Morrison had called him for a special job. He had picked up Richard from a warehouse in an industrial area of the city. Richard had been agitated, his clothes disheveled, and he had been carrying a large duffel bag. He had instructed Patterson to drive to the alley behind Merchant Street, where he had removed something from the duffel bag and placed it behind the dumpster, covering it with a tarp that had been in the trunk. "I knew it was a body," Patterson said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't see it clearly, but I knew. The way he handled it. And Mr. Morrison, he was different after that night. Cold. He paid me $50,000 in cash to forget what I saw. I took the money. I've regretted it every day since." With Patterson's testimony, the audio recording, Thomas's notebook, and the physical evidence from the crime scene, prosecutors had enough to charge Richard Morrison with first-degree murder. But the investigation didn't stop there. The names in Thomas Brennan's notebook led to a wider investigation involving the FBI and the IRS. The money laundering scheme had connected to organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and business owners across Oregon, Washington, and California. Over the course of the next year, federal investigators built cases against 23 individuals and 7 corporations. Richard Morrison's trial began 14 months after Marcus Chen found the remains in the alley. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. Thomas Brennan had discovered criminal activity, confronted the wrong person, and paid for it with his life. Richard Morrison had murdered him or had arranged his murder, and had dumped his body in an alley, assuming it would be discovered and disposed of as an unknown homeless person, a tragedy that would generate minimal investigation. But Richard had made mistakes. He had left Thomas's identification with the body. He had failed to destroy the notebook. And most crucially, he had trusted his driver to remain silent forever. During the trial, Patterson testified about that night, his voice shaking as he described helping to conceal a murder. The audio recording of Richard's threats was played for the jury. Thomas's notebook was entered as evidence, each page a testament to his diligence and bravery. Maria Santos, Thomas's girlfriend, testified about his behavior in the weeks before his disappearance. He was scared, she told the jury, tears streaming down her face. He knew he had stumbled onto something dangerous, but he felt obligated to report it. Tommy believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous. He said that financial crimes might not seem as serious as violent crimes, but they hurt people. They destroy lives. He wanted to stop it. She paused, composing herself. The last time I saw him, he told me that if anything happened to him, I should make sure people knew he didn't run away. He said he would never abandon me, never disappear voluntarily. He made me promise to keep pushing for answers if he went missing. Kept that promise. For 8 years I kept that promise. And now, finally, we know what happened to him. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Richard Morrison was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Several of his associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years for their roles in the money laundering operation and the subsequent cover-up. The alley behind Merchant Street looks much the same as it did before that November morning. The restaurants still operate, their dumpsters still line the narrow passage, and sanitation workers still make their rounds. But there is one difference. On the brick wall, near where Thomas Brennan's remains were found, someone has placed a small memorial plaque. It reads, Thomas Brennan, 1978 to 2016. He stood for truth and justice. His courage brought light to corruption. Marcus Chen, who made the discovery that morning, says he thinks about Thomas Brennan often. I pass that spot every day on my route, he explains. Every day I remember finding him there. It's sobering to think that he was there for 8 years, just a few feet away from people going about their daily lives, and nobody knew. But I'm glad he was found. I'm glad his family got answers. And I'm glad the people who did this are in prison. Detective Linda Morrison, no relation to Richard Morrison despite the shared name, considers the case one of the most significant of her career. What Thomas Brennan did took extraordinary courage, she reflects. He was a regular person, a financial analyst doing his job, and he stumbled onto a massive criminal operation. He could have looked the other way. He could have quit and found another job. But he chose to document what he found, to gather evidence, to try to stop it. That choice cost him his life, but ultimately, it brought down an organization that had been harming people for years. The case has had lasting impacts beyond the individual convictions. The evidence gathered during the investigation led to reforms in financial oversight, stricter regulations on small investment firms, and improved protocols for reporting suspicious transactions. Thomas Brennan's notebook became a case study in financial crime investigation, taught in law enforcement academies as an example of how a determined individual can uncover complex schemes. Maria Santos has established the Thomas Brennan Foundation, which provides support to whistleblowers and their families. The foundation offers legal assistance, financial support, and protection resources to individuals who expose wrongdoing in corporate and financial settings. Tommy died because he tried to do the right thing, Maria explains. I don't want anyone else to face that same danger alone. If the foundation can help protect even one person who chooses to speak up against corruption, then something positive will have come from this tragedy. Dr. Young, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, notes that the case demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence even in the most difficult circumstances. Those remains had been exposed to the elements, to animals, to years of decomposition. But because the perpetrator had wrapped them in plastic, certain crucial pieces of evidence were preserved. The notebook, in particular, might have been completely destroyed if not for that plastic wrapping. It's ironic that the killer's attempt to conceal the crime actually helped preserve the evidence that would ultimately convict him. The cell phone data recovery was also crucial, and it has influenced how investigators approach old technology in cold cases. The audio recording of Richard Morrison threatening Thomas Brennan was the single most powerful piece of evidence at trial, beyond even the physical evidence of the remains themselves. It allowed the jury to hear, in the victim's own recording, the motive and the threat that led to his murder. For the restaurants along Merchant Street, the case brought unwanted attention but also reflection. Several of the owners have said that they now pay more attention to the alleys behind their businesses, to the people who might be living rough in those spaces, to anything unusual. It's a small change, but it represents a broader awareness of the spaces we ignore in our daily lives. The case also highlighted issues with the original missing person investigation. When Thomas Brennan was reported missing in 2016, investigators had noted his concerns about work-related issues, but they had not pursued that angle aggressively enough. The initial investigation had focused on Thomas's personal life, looking for relationship problems, financial troubles, or mental health issues that might explain a voluntary disappearance. The connection to his workplace concerns had been documented but not thoroughly investigated. This oversight has led to changes in how missing person cases are handled in Portland. Investigators are now trained to take workplace conflicts and professional concerns more seriously as potential factors in disappearances. If someone disappears after expressing fears about their job or their discovery of wrongdoing, that information is flagged for immediate follow-up. The broader money laundering investigation that stemmed from Thomas's notebook has continued to expand. As of 2 years after the initial discovery, federal investigators have traced connections to criminal operations in 7 states and 2 foreign countries. The scheme that Thomas uncovered was even larger than his notebook suggested, with tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, real estate, and political campaigns. His documentation provided the foundation for understanding how the operation worked, but the full scope is still being unraveled. Richard Morrison has appealed his conviction, arguing that the audio recording should not have been admissible because Thomas recorded it without his knowledge. The appeals court rejected this argument, ruling that Oregon's recording laws allow for one-party consent, meaning Thomas had every right to record a conversation he was participating in. Morrison's legal team has indicated they plan to continue appealing, but legal experts give them little chance of success given the overwhelming evidence. The warehouse where Richard Morrison called his driver from that night in March 2016 was also investigated. Forensic teams found traces of blood matching Thomas Brennan's DNA in a storage room in the building. This evidence confirmed that Thomas had been killed there before being transported to the alley. The warehouse had been rented under a shell company controlled by Morrison and Associates, providing additional proof of premeditation and planning in the murder. Patterson, the driver who eventually came forward, received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. He pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Many observers felt this was too lenient given his role in concealing a murder for 8 years, But prosecutors argued that without his testimony, convicting Richard Morrison would have been significantly more difficult. Patterson is scheduled for release next year and has said he plans to work with prison reform organizations, trying to help others find the courage to come forward when they witness crimes. The case has been featured in several true crime documentaries and podcasts, each examining different aspects of the investigation. Some focus on the financial crimes angle, exploring how money laundering operations hide in plain sight within legitimate businesses. Others focus on the investigative techniques that solve the case, from document preservation to cell phone data recovery. Still others examine the human cost, telling Thomas's story and Maria's 8-year fight to find answers. For the Portland Police Department, the case represents both a failure and a success. A failure because Thomas Brennan should never have been killed, and the initial missing person investigation should have been more thorough. A success because when his remains were finally found, investigators built an airtight case and brought his killer to justice. Detective Morrison keeps a photo of Thomas Brennan on her desk, a reminder of why the work matters and what happens when investigations fail to follow every lead. The alley behind Merchant Street continues its daily rhythm. Delivery trucks squeeze through in the early morning hours. Restaurant workers take their breaks leaning against the brick walls, smoking cigarettes and checking their phones. Sanitation workers make their rounds, collecting the refuse of urban life. But now, that small memorial plaque serves as a reminder that these overlooked spaces, these in-between places that we pass through without noticing, can hold terrible secrets. And sometimes, when those secrets are finally revealed, they can change everything. Thomas Brennan's notebook, the one that contained his careful documentation of the crimes he discovered, has been preserved as evidence. Eventually, when all legal proceedings are complete, it will be donated to a law enforcement museum, where it will serve as a teaching tool for future investigators and as a memorial to a man who chose courage over convenience, truth over safety. Maria Santos visits the memorial plaque several times a year, leaving flowers and spending a few quiet moments in the alley where Thomas was found. "It's not where I want to remember him," she says. "I'd rather remember him in the beautiful places we went together, the moments when we were happy. But this place is important too. This is where he was finally found, where the truth started coming out. This is where justice began." 8 years is a long time to wait for answers. 8 years of wondering, hoping, fearing. 8 years of birthdays and holidays marked by absence. 8 years of investigation files growing cold and hope fading. But in the end, the truth emerged from that alley behind Merchant Street, and justice, though delayed, was finally served. The human remains found in that back alley belonged to a man who tried to do the right thing. The clues that solved the case were the very evidence he had gathered, preserved through the years, waiting to tell his story. Thomas Brennan's voice, silenced by violence, ultimately spoke through his notebook and his recordings, ensuring that his death would not be in vain and his killers would not escape justice. Sometimes the most ordinary places conceal extraordinary stories. Sometimes the truth waits patiently, hidden but not destroyed, ready to emerge when the time comes. And sometimes a sanitation worker making his daily rounds, a detective refusing to let a cold case stay cold, and the courage of one person who documented what he discovered can come together to ensure that justice, no matter how delayed, finally prevails. What do you think? Would you have the courage to document evidence of a crime if you knew it might put your life in danger? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories that reveal the hidden dramas unfolding in the spaces we walk past every day.